The Boy Who Rizzed Part 1. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of Number 4, Privet Drive, were proud to be perfectly normal. Mr. Dursley, a large man with no neck, worked as a director at Grunnings, a drill company. Mrs. Dursley, thin and blonde, spent most of her time spying on the neighbors. They had a son, Dudley, whom they adored and considered the finest boy in the world. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they had a secret they feared would be discovered: the Potters, Mrs. Dursley's sister and her family. The Dursleys disliked the Potters because they were everything the Dursleys weren't: unusual and strange. The Dursleys had never met their nephew, Harry, and they didn't want him to have anything to do with Dudley. One dull Tuesday morning, as Mr. Dursley drove to work, he noticed strange things happening. First, he saw a cat reading a map, or so he thought. Then, on his way to town, he saw people dressed in cloaks, whispering excitedly about the Potters and their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley grew uneasy and tried to convince himself it was nothing. At work, he didn't notice the owls flying during the day, but when he went out for lunch, he saw more strange people whispering about the Potters. Later, an old man wearing a violet cloak hugged him and declared that you-know-who had finally fallen. Mr. Dursley was bewildered and shaken. On his way home, he saw the same cat from earlier, sitting on his garden wall, staring at him. At home, Mrs. Dursley was discussing trivial matters as usual, but Mr. Dursley couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He saw a news report about owls flying during the day and shooting stars, which unsettled him even more. He nervously asked his wife if she'd heard from her sister, but she grew upset at the mention of the Potters. That night, while Mrs. Dursley slept, Mr. Dursley peered out the window and saw the cat again, watching Privet Drive. He was convinced it was waiting for something. He tried to convince himself it couldn't affect them, but deep down, he knew he was.